Okay, so we're not doing Isaiah. Make that clear right up front. We'll save that for one of the other two next week, Lord willing. I've been over in the high school class in the last 2 semesters, and we studied the book of Matthew for the last several weeks. In fact, we were supposed to do 26 chapters in 13 weeks. And there's just too much in the Gospels for that to work. So Aaron, I apologize to you up front. We're gonna go over some old territory we've just been over. But I want to draw your attention to actually the 21st chapter, I believe, is when Jesus made the triumphal entry. And the reason I say that from the 21st chapter on is the last week of his life. Now that's an important note to me because Christ knew he's got 1 week to live. He knows what's about to happen. He's trying to prepare his apostles for this time. And I remember Phil in the last week of his life. He wrote several letters to people that he felt like he needed to write. That was the most important thing on his mind at the time, and he felt like he had little time to get it done. This is the atmosphere we're going to study. Everything that we talk about from the 21st chapter on is probably the most important thing that he can think of that's left to say. Now, with that said, I'd like to begin in the 26th chapter, and we'll go however long that lets us go. And there's some things here, and we all know this story. This is not new to any of us, I think. But there's some things in here. Every time I read it, I see something new. And I think we'll talk about a few of those things tonight. But in the beginning of the 26th chapter, in verse 3, you see the chief priests and the scribes and the elders are trying to decide how to handle Jesus. And they're plotting to take his life, but they realize there's the Feast of the Passover. And this isn't a good time. So we'll wait until this is over, and then we'll figure this out. One little thing happens, though, that changes their mind. And that is Judas. And in the 14th, 15th verse, Judas goes to them, and he says, every time I read this, it's just kind of chilling to me. He says, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you?" What does that tell you about Judas's character? What are you willing to give me to give up the Son of God? And we all know that price was 30 pieces of silver. Can you put a price on it? So we're going to go in, and he's going to celebrate the Passover. And the symbol of the Passover, and we discussed it in our class. And by the way, I may have some of you that were in here in that high school class. I don't know if you were. I apologize. We're going to do it again. The Passover, as you remember, was when Israel was leaving Egypt, and the last plague was they're going to kill the firstborn. And the only way that they were saved from that is to put the blood over the doorpost, and the angel would pass over them, and that child wouldn't die. And so that symbol is going to be one we're looking at in this example of Christ and his sacrifice as well. So he institutes the Lord's Supper, what we call that in this chapter. And he's getting ready to do this. But in the evening before they came, in verse 20, it says, when they had come, he sat down with the 12. Now, as they were eating, he said, "Assuredly I say unto you, one of you will betray me." We all know that story. And by the way, I always tell my class to put yourself in the story. Can you do that? Put yourself there with those apostles. If you heard Jesus say to you, "One of you is going to betray me," what would go through your mind? What did all of they do? What did all of them ask? Is it me? Even Judas asked, "Is it me?" And if you remember what Jesus said to him, he says, "You have said it." But I can just see them all going, "What do you mean? Who is it going to be?" And he even gives the sign of which one it's going to be. In verse 25, Judas, and we just mentioned this, he says, "Who's betraying him?" Answered and said, "Rabbi, is it I?" And Jesus said, "You have said it." I want you to think about if you had been in Judas's shoes, why would you have asked that?
To look like it wasn't you.
Okay, well, or does he really know who it is? What do you think he did and thought after he heard you have said it? Whoops. But he still does it. Again, a little bit more about Judas's character. By the way, go back if you remember. Do you remember any other problems that Judas had as we look at the ministry of Christ? Do you remember any of that?
He's a thief.
How?
He stole money out of the treasury.
Okay. They got a little pot of money that they're using to live on, to eat, to go buy fishes and loaves or whatever it was. And Judas is pilfering from that pot that the 12 of them were using to eat. What does that say about his character?
Hey, Ronnie?
Yes.
That definitely is his crutch. That is where it's at. I'm not sure if Judas really understood the outcome.
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt that he understood it.
And which is not an excuse or defense at all. But seeing Jesus escape and disappear and diverse, constantly. I'll tell you where he is, but you'll never catch him, or nobody's calling yet. He's seen this type of stuff, miracles and those type of things. I'm not sure if, and not to dismiss the crutch was money. He pilfers.
There's one other thing and I'm glad that's where I was headed. You took me right where I wanted to go. What does that say about his conviction about Jesus as the Christ? How could anyone truly believe this is the Son of God and do what he did? And we're going to talk about Peter in a minute, and that's a different deal altogether. But Judas could not have believed that he was really the Son of God. I don't see that's a possibility. Yes, Tyler.
I mean, if we're going to put ourselves in their shoes, I think we do it. We state that we believe. I don't know if we would go as far. We would all hope that we wouldn't go as far. And we make all kinds of excuses. If I was there, if I'd have seen those miracles firsthand, I'd have never done this or that. But we have all kinds of opportunities, and at much less smaller scale to deny Christ than what Judas did. And so, I don't know if yes, if you're talking about the belief that leads to obedience, and yes, in that moment he was, but I don't think that he doubted who Christ was. I think that his love of money was overwhelming. And we see that, I think that's the reason that we see the history of Judas, that this was a problem, this was a temptation of his. I agree, I don't know if he knew the outcome because we see what he did, but I don't know if I would say that he didn't believe that Jesus was the Christ.
Let me rephrase that. And I think all of them are guilty of this, by the way. They didn't understand the kingdom And we stressed this in this class. This is all about the kingdom. Matthew, the Gospels are all about the kingdom, establishing the kingdom and what's a part of the kingdom. I don't think any of them understood what kind of kingdom that we're talking about, and that's probably part of his problem as well. And and by the way, Tyler's hit on exactly where I want to go with this. Application. How do we get something out of this that we can use and apply and kind of look in our lives too, like Tyler's already suggested? What would we be guilty of today that's similar? And that's a pretty difficult question to answer. We'll talk about more about that in just a minute with Peter. So here we are. Jesus is betrayed. Now they're going to institute the Lord's Supper, and we know all about that. I'm not going to focus on that so much. I want to get into Peter. And you know, Peter, Jesus already told him that someone's going to betray him, but he also tells Peter, you're going to deny me. In verse 31, I want to draw your attention to one other thing. Then Jesus said to them, this is right after he instituted the Lord's Supper. He's told them that there's one going to betray. He says, all of you will stumble because of me this night. That's something I didn't pick up on all the time. All of you will stumble. How did they do that? How did they all stumble? They scattered. We focus on Peter. He was at least close. I don't know where the other guys were. I think there's some, and forgive me guys, I didn't have time to really look over this. I believe John may have been near, and that's in another gospel. It's not in Matthew's account. But that's a prophecy. It says it was written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. Can you imagine, here's a host of men with clubs and knives and swords, and they come and they snatch Jesus, and they take him away. What would you have done if you'd watched Jesus being dragged away? I don't know the answer to that. I know what I hope I would do, right?
Yeah, and this kind of gets back to some things you've already said, but remember when they arrested him in the garden, what did Peter do? Peter drew his sword out, and even though Jesus had been telling them, I'm going to die, and that's the plan, right, and I'm going to be raised up, they still didn't understand that.
And we're going to get that in a second as well.
And so as these things are happening to Jesus and him being arrested, it's not like they're going, oh, well, this is what's supposed to happen. That's fine.
Yeah, exactly.
They were scared, right?
Exactly.
They didn't expect that this was a good thing or a right thing that was happening.
And my point's simple. I mean, it's easy for us to point fingers. But this was a serious, emotional, scary situation. Nevin?
This isn't how it was supposed to happen in their mind.
In their mind, that's right.
In their minds, this was contrary to everything that was supposed to happen.
And
you see that with them all scattering. They're like, now what? And after he's raised, you see that too, where
Yep.
they go, I guess I'll go back fishing.
And I won't have time to get that far tonight, but
Right.
yes, that's right.
This wasn't the plan.
And we're getting there, but now let's focus on Peter for a second. Because this is where I want to make the application, really, to us tonight. Look at what Peter said, beginning in verse 32. Peter answered, 33. Even if I were made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble. And Jesus answered, assuredly I say to you, this night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter says, even if I have to die, I will not deny you. And so said all the disciples. Can you feel the confidence that Peter had? He did. He was a very confident guy. He knew he could do what he needed to do. And we know the end of that story. And Jesus told him what he was going to do. And he said that to all of them. Not just Peter. All of them. So we come to the garden. And another, we hear a lot today about deity versus humanity with Jesus. We're going to talk about a little humanity right now. This story in the garden, hard to read. I remember a few years ago we did a song service on this, and Nevin had me going because he couldn't get it read. I don't think that's a bad thing. He starts here, and he says he took, in verse 37, he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Is that an attribute of God? Deeply distressed. We're going to get more. He said, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me. And by the way, Jesus knows this is the last 2 days of his life. If you knew you had 2 days to live, what emotion would you be going through? And we're seeing it in this story. So he went a little further and he fell on his face and prayed. He fell on his face. Have you ever fallen on your face in deep emotion? I have. If you've done it, what feeling do you have when you get that low? When I've felt that low and I've just fallen on my face, I don't know what else I can do. I'm ready to ask for help. So what does he pray? He fell on his face and he prayed, saying, "Oh, Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Is there another way? I don't want to go through what I know I'm fixing to do." Who would? And then he came back after that and he found his disciples sleeping. And he's frustrated. This happens 3 times. He's frustrated. Why is he frustrated? He could use some people that are caring about what's about to happen. And again, I think the point's been made by several. They don't understand. He's been telling them what's going to happen, and they still don't get it. And he says to them, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. You see that contrast between God and humanity? If he was God, he wouldn't have weakly flesh. His flesh wouldn't be weak. He was both. He couldn't have done the miracles that he did and the wonders and the elements of the world obey him if he wasn't God. But he wouldn't have this deep emotion if he was only God. And he says, "What? Could you not watch with me for an hour? Could you not just give me an hour?" What's he really asking them to watch for, Tyler?
Well, I wasn't.
Go ahead. I asked that while you had your head in the air.
I don't think that I think that's probably true about Jesus, but when he's saying the spirit is willing, the flesh is weak, he's talking about the disciples not staying away. Because I don't doubt that they probably had a desire to, but they let their fleshly desire of being tired overcome their desire to be there for Christ.
Right.
I agree. I think that that they look back on those moments and with a great deal of regret. And like you said with Peter, he goes on to preach boldly in the temple and, be arrested and do these things, but certainly has moments of weakness.
Well, and I asked a minute ago, I said, can you not watch it with me now? What do they need to watch for?
The Son of Man is about to be betrayed.
Okay? What's about to happen?
They're about to come get him.
They're fixing to come get him. Watch for me. I need a little warning. Watch with me. Stay up. This is serious stuff.
Well, I personally think that his commentary there on the spirit is willing and the flesh is weak, that goes back to the table.
Yes.
All of they voice their not wanting to be the one who betrays him. I'm willing to go to death for you. They've stayed with him all these years, and yet it's the fleshly issues that get in their way.
Right.
And the issue in the garden is the same issue they had at the table and had every step
Right.
of the way.
And then he ends this little segment here in the 45th verse when he says, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is being betrayed." This is present tense now. "In the hands of the sinner. Rise up and let us go. My betrayer is at hand." I mean, he knows what's happening. Come with me. And by the way, let's get a time frame on this. We started the Lord's Supper, or the instituting of the Lord's Supper, as we call it. You got to guess at what time of the day that might have been? It's a little bit of a guess, but I would think it's evening.
Well, as the sun goes down.
Right. Peter's going to deny him before the cock crows. What does that suggest?
Morning.
Okay, it's going to go all night. It's going to go all night. So here they come. And in verse 48, this is something that keeps getting me. Now Judas is going to be called the betrayer. And it says, "Now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, 'Whomever I kiss, this is the one, seize him.' And immediately he went up to Jesus and said, 'Greetings, Rabbi,' and kissed him." What's Jesus' reply to that? That's what got me. I can't get over this next statement. His next statement.
Called him a friend.
Say again?
Called him a friend.
Yes. He says, and I've lost my place. Okay, verse 50. "Friend, why have you come?" Friend. There's so much in Matthew, in the Gospels, that is subtle, that you don't pick up every time. And this is one of those things that I missed for a long time. Friend, why have you come? Now, when he said that to Judas, how do you think that made him feel? I know how I'd feel. I don't know about Judas. But I keep seeing all of this stuff that happens and make Judas go, oh my, he knows a lot. And maybe there's more to this than I've given it credit. And I think we'll see that in the end of Judas when he goes and hangs himself. And I don't think we're going to get there tonight. And then Jesus said, okay, so then they lay their hands on him, and we've already made mention, Peter's going to pull out his sword. And by the way, I don't think this even says Peter here. I think you got to go somewhere else. Yeah. Peter's not mentioned in Matthew, but it is in the other Gospels. Peter pulls his sword. He cuts off the ear. Jesus heals it. We know the story. He says, put down your swords. In verse 52, if you live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword, basically, is what he says here. And then he says, or do you think that I cannot pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels? And if that happened, then he says, how then could the Scriptures be fulfilled? This must happen. And that's what we've been alluding to all night, is they didn't understand. They didn't realize it had to happen. Peter, bless his heart, he's ready to fight for Jesus. And I really believe he's ready to die right then. And Jesus pretty much says that. If you're going to live by the sword, you're going to die by it. DJ?
And I love this point because just right before that, 3 times he prayed for this to pass.
Yeah.
You know, so, and he knew it had to happen, but yet he still took that to God. You know, his worries, his troubles, and we see here also that, you know, sometimes people lose faith in God because their prayers are answered the way they want them to be. You know, and we see here that Jesus prayed for this thing 3 times, but it had to be done. But Jesus and God understood that. You know what I mean? I think that's just like kind of a powerful point.
Yeah, it is. And I want to go back to the question that I, started with a little while ago. How does this apply to us? How can we take something from this that we can use in our own life? And in a minute, we're going to see this portraying the rooster's going to crow and Peter's going to be overwhelmed with grief. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But how much confidence did Peter already show now? I mean, he pulls his sword out. There's a mob here with swords. Do you think he's going to fight them all off? I think Peter was ready to die. And yet we're going to see just a little later that's going to reverse around a little bit. And just keep that in mind. And again, I might want to make us, what would you have done? Peter was very, very confident. There's no way I'll go to death before I deny you or before I do these things you predicted of me. There's no way. And my point there that I'm trying to give us a little caution is, can we be overconfident? And how can we avoid that? What did Peter need to avoid what he was about to do? We don't really think about that a whole lot. He demonstrated a lot of faith. More than the rest of them. And yet, we know the story, and that's not the way it happened. So, he's taken to the high priest, and I know you haven't had time to read this story or look at it, but what happens now whenever they start questioning Jesus? You remember? They ask him a bunch of questions. What's his answer? He doesn't answer. Again, a prophecy. And finally, the high priest, in verse 63, says, the high priest answered and said to him, I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us you are the Christ, the Son of God. What's his answer? Almost the same thing he said to Judas. You have said. Okay, he's admitted he's the Son of God. That's all we need. Is it? I want to ask that question. If he was guilty of that and not the Son of God, would they have been justified? Yes. Yes, he would have been guilty if he wasn't who he claimed to be. Their mistake was that he was who he claimed to be. So they've done it. They've got it. No problem. He's admitted it. We are justified. He needs to die. In fact, that's what they said in verse 66. They answered and said, he's deserving of death. What's the problem? They're ready to crucify him right now. What's the problem?
They're under Roman law. They can't.
Exactly. So they got to turn him over to Pilate now. Or, well, Matthew's account does. And now it's going to change. The charge is going to change. Why? When they bring him to Rome, do they care? Yeah. So what's the charge going to be now?
Trying to overthrow Caesar.
Well,
Trying to be a king.
he's the king. He's going to overthrow Rome. You better, you got to take care of this guy. But we know the story. What about Pilate and his wife? What about his wife? She had a dream. What was the dream? I don't know exactly. Yeah, it troubled her. It was a nightmare. That's what it was. And she says, Pilate, you don't need to have anything to do with this guy. So what's Pilate decide to do?
He wants very much to let it go.
But he's a politician. He wants to try and figure out a way out of this deal. So he's got a plan. What's the plan?
Put up a really, really bad guy
Yeah,
and
exactly.
offer to release Jesus.
All right, a really, really bad guy, Barabbas. This is a murderer. Surely the people will pick Jesus over this guy.
And ironically, Barabbas had been involved in insurrection.
Yep,
Which is what they're
exactly. So they turn Barabbas loose and keep Jesus because that's the deal. Now, Pilate does and I think this is where we get the term washing our hands of it. He says, this guy is not worthy of death. I have nothing to do with it. You do what you need to do. He kind of bows out. And again, Matthew leaves out a little of this story and where they were handed over and all that stuff. But then we come back in chapter 27. When the morning came, they plotted. Yes, okay. In verse 3, Judas, his betrayer again, seeing that he had been condemned, was remorseful and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders and saying, I've sinned and betrayed innocent blood. He throws the money on the floor, and we know the story. Somebody tell me what you feel went through Judas's mind now.
What was your question, Ronnie? I'm sorry. What was your question?
Judas has got remorse now. We hadn't demonstrated any of that throughout the Gospels, but now he's remorseful. He's sorry. He comes back. He throws the money that he's been given to do this thing back on the floor, and he goes out and he hangs himself. Yes?
Well, I think, personal opinion, but this is the ultimate betrayal in his suicide. Where, God didn't label Peter the denier, where this was it. And what the takeaway I take, putting yourself in someone's shoes, no matter what we've done, no matter where we're at, we can always come out of it. Look at Peter, look at others. This is not the way. Remorse can lead, depression can lead to dark.
Do you remember what was said about the betrayer? I don't know how to ask this without giving the answer away. What did it say would be better if he had never been born? That doesn't sound like he's got much of a chance for heaven. Been better if he'd never been born. And he realizes he's betrayed it, and it says innocent blood. He threw down the pieces of silver. He departed and went out and hanged himself. And we know the story. The rope broke. He falls, and it's a horrible death. But let's go back to Peter. Well, we've talked about Pilate and Barabbas, but real quickly, I want to get into Peter. If I can find it. I've already went past it. I'm sorry. Okay, we know the story. Peter denies Jesus 3 times. The rooster crows, and immediately Peter remembers this. I want to direct your attention to Luke, the 22nd chapter, I think verse 61 or 62. And this sentence, I can't escape this sentence. It always just puts a picture in my mind. I can't visualize exactly where Jesus was and where Peter was, but he was outside the courtyard. Jesus is inside. How do I know that? Because in Luke, the 22nd chapter, verse 61 or 2, immediately after the rooster crows, it says, Jesus turned and looked at him. And so, I'm going to end this tonight with this thought. It might take a couple more minutes, but with this thought, I want you to think about what could you imagine was going through his mind when he just did what he promised he wouldn't do, and after he realizes he's done it, Jesus looks at him. I've tried to make that image work for me. When I catch myself doing something that's probably not what would glorify the Lord, I want to see him looking at me. And the bottom line here, guys, is we're talking about how do we keep from sin, and how do we use these stories that we read in the Bible to help us, not just point fingers at the history, but how do we take something from this that we can use? And I'm using the fact that Jesus looked at him when he sinned. And now when I do something that I feel like maybe I shouldn't have done, I try to see Jesus looking at me. That's a difficult thing, to play with your mind a little bit. But it works for me.
I think what is so interesting is that between Judas and Peter, here when he looked at him and he went out and he wept bitterly. And I would think that today, if we, having done something sinful, wrong, and Jesus looks at us, that if we repent, isn't it wonderful we can have forgiveness?
Yes, and I think there's one other difference there that she's made me remember. Remember the discourse that Jesus had with Peter earlier when he says, "Do you love me?" And his answer was, "Feed my sheep." And I kind of think at that point in time, when he's obviously very remorseful, because he's realized he did just exactly what he promised he wouldn't do, I got to think that in the back of his mind he's remembering that Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." He had a purpose. Jesus told him what that purpose was going to be, and he needed him. I don't think Judas ever had a purpose other than himself. And this story, I still go back to the song service we had several years ago, where we read Scripture and sang songs about this point in time. And it was difficult to read. And if it's difficult to read, that means we see and feel the emotion. We need to. And I made it through that far, and that's all I figured I would get to. So sorry for the interruption in the schedule, but maybe we'll get back to normal next week. Thank you.